Hey guys, SimCoder here, and today we'll be finishing up our auth system, and we are going to do this by saving the user's data to Firestore. Because remember, Firebase auth and Firebase Firestore are two completely different things, so even though we logged in with the user and we registered a user, we still don't have a place where we can store his data, where we can fetch that user's data. So we need to use Firestore, which is a database, a document-based database, in order to do that. So we'll be using also Redux, which allows us to have a state which runs throughout the React project so that we don't have to pass props along each and every single component. So it makes it a lot easier to structure out a project. So yeah, let's do it. If the video is going a little too slow for you, then feel free to change the speed of the video in the video settings. So the first thing that we have to do is to install some packages. We will have to enable Redux in our project, as I've said, and I'm not going to touch a lot on Redux. I'll give you the general view and the general look into Redux. However, if you want to learn a lot more, then I would suggest you watch some tutorial on it. I'll leave a link down below for a good tutorial so that you don't have to search around. It is easy to understand. However, the terms are kind of complicated and not really straight to the point, so it might generate some confusion. So let's install Redux and you'll see what I'm talking about in a second. The first thing that we'll need is to install Redux. So run npm I redux in your project folder, root folder, give it some time. Okay, after it has done installing, and it should take some time, we are going to install another package called React Redux. And this package simply makes the connection between Redux and React. It makes it more seamless to use both in the same project. So run it. And finally, we are going to install React Thunk. This package is a middleware for Redux, which will allow us to more easily build actions and save to the database and fetch from the database. So it is a really cool package. Install it, give it some time. And okay, we are done. Next thing, we are going to come into our project using VS Code or whatever code editor you are using, and we are going to jump into register. In register, we are going to save to the database, and we are going to do it after we create the user with email and password. So the user is created, and we right after that is done, we are going to create an instance in the database for that same user. For that, let's come into our project in Firebase, and I'm going to go into Cloud Firestore. This is the database that we are going to use. You could use a real-time database, but I believe Firestore is the better fit for our needs. Click on Create Database, and for now, we are going to start in test mode. These are the rules for our database. So by the end of the database, by the end of the project, when you want to release the product, you should change these rules in order to make your database secure. Because remember, right now, if we set our rules to test mode, anyone that has, let me come in here, this Firebase config would be able to access the database, and that's not good. So use rules in order to restrict the user's movement inside the database so that you can protect yourself and protect your users. But for now, we are in development, we are doing the development process, so I'm going to start it in test mode, just make things easier and leave the rules for the end of the project. Okay, so right after you create the database, this is the page that you come to. So in Firebase, it is a document-based database, as I've said, and that means that you have basically little cards that contain information. So you can build a collection of cards, which imagine is a box filled with cards. And in this case, because we want to create a user, our collection will be users. And you don't need to create, I'm just doing this in order to show you how it will look like. Then each card, which in this case is a document, the real term of it, will have an ID. It will have, and it can have fields, which are attributes, and you can create as many as you'd like. But in the case of the user, we will want to have a name, and the value will be users, can be SimCoder. Let's use real examples. And for the email, I'll just say simcoder@mail.com, whatever, something like that. Set the ID to auto, but this ID will be the ID that we get from the authentication, so it will be different. It won't be automatically generated. We hit save, and we see that we create a collection, and that collection can have as many documents as we'd like. And these documents are, again, these little cards with attributes inside it that correspond, in this case, to the user. So it is basically an object with all the attributes that we want. Okay, so this will just show you how it works. I'm going to delete everything. Okay, I can leave the collection, there's no problem. And I'm going to go back into our VS Code. So in register, as I've said, I want to create a collection with the user after the create with user with email and password has been done successfully. And to do that, I'm going to hit enter. And now let's check, and we have Firebase initialized. So we are going to do firebase.firestore.collection, and the collection again will be users. Let me move this to the side like this. Then we'll have a doc, which will have the ID of the user ID, and in order to get that, we can simply do firebase.auth.currentuser.uid. Because remember, and we've done this in the previous lesson, after the user has logged in, this variable won't be null, and we'll be able to access the user parameters that are, and let me come in here, that are in the authentication page. So in this case, we'll get this information that's here, and we'll get the user ID, which is this one. Okay? So in order to save it, now all we have to do is say, and let me do like this, set. And now in set, we are going to open curly brackets, and we are going to pass along all of the parameters that we want to save in this document. In this case, we only have two parameters, which are name and email. So that's the ones that we are going to save for now. And that's it. So I'm going to come into the terminal and run expo starts -c. This will start expo clearing the cache first. So let's give it some time, and I'll be right back. Okay, after it has done compiling, I'm going to run in web browser, and the user is already logged in. So I'm going to go into private mode, just so that we can save the previous state. Come in here, and now we don't have anything saved, so we can actually just register. So I'm going to register with test2@gmail.com, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 will be the password. Okay, so here we are, and I'm going to sign up right now. User is logged in. Let's hope everything went smoothly. I reloaded the page, and as you can see, a document is created with test2@gmail.com and the name test2. Let's check if the ID of the user matches this ID. And to do that, again, I'm going to go into authentication. And as you can see, O3ZE and O3ZE. So we have our user in the database right now. So we are ready to finally start using Redux to fetch the data of the user, to save some data of the user. So right now, I only saved to the database cleanly without Redux, so that you guys could see how it works without anything else, so that it is easier on the eye for you guys. So for now, I'm going to clear all of that, and we are going to start implementing Redux. So in order to implement Redux in our Firebase, I'm going to just import everything and create all of the folder structure and then explain what each folder does and what each file does. So the first thing that I'm going to do is come in here and create a folder, not a file, a folder, which will be called Redux. This is how I like to structure out Redux. So yeah, and there are other ways of doing it, but for me, this is the easier way to do it. And then in Redux, we are going to have 4 folders. The first one will be the actions folder, and actions in Redux are calls to action. So whenever you want to alter something within the Redux state, you call up an action, and that action will call Firestore and fetch something from the database and then alter the state of the application. So in this action, we'll have a file called index.js. Then in Redux, we'll have the reducers, and the reducers are what stores the state of the application, and these are pure functions which simply store everything. So in the reducers, we'll have an index.js and a users.js, at least a user.js, I'm sorry, at least in this lesson. Then we'll add more. Then we'll have yet another folder called constants. And this, as the name implies, will just contain some constants which we can use in our Redux so that we don't have to be always naming a variable which is prone to errors. And these constants will have an index.js again. Okay, now going into reducers, we are going to go into index.js, and in order to structure out the project better, I created yet another user.js, which will have everything that's related to user. However, you could do everything inside the index.js. But to make things a bit more clear, we are going to have multiple files for reducers. And in order to do that, we'll have to combine them in the same index.js. And Redux actually offers that same function that we need to use. So it is called combine reducers from Redux. Let's make this a tiny bit bigger. Okay. Then we'll say we'll import the user function, user file, better yet. Or in here, it is the function that we are going to import. And this is from user. Because it is in the same file, we say /user, obviously. Now we have to create our reducers. So reducers in this first part of the lesson, we'll just have the user.js, obviously, and this will be the user state, which will be connected to this user, which will create inside this user.js function right now. But for now, we must export default reducers so that our store can be free to access this variable. Okay, easy enough. Now jumping into user. Now in here we'll have everything that's connected to our user, our user variable, user state variable. And for that, we'll first need to set our initial state. So this is kind of like a constructor, if you want to think of it like it. And in the initial state, you'll have a current user, which will be null. We'll be adding other variables to these initial states, but for now, we'll have a current user, which will contain a bunch of parameters inside of it. Okay, and now we must create our export for user. Let's do it like this. Open parentheses, say that the state is equal to initial state if no state is passed along in this function, and action. So remember, our actions will be calling upon the database, fetching data and sending it to our reducer, which will then update the state. And we can do this by doing a return state. So we'll pass along our initial state, and then we pass along the current user, which will be what updates within that set state. So we get it from action.currentUser. This will be passed along from our action, which we'll create next. But for now, that's all that we have to do. And in here, there's a plus a major sign missing. So that's it. The reducers are actually pretty simple. They just store the state and update it whenever they receive an action. Okay, this is the most simpler state that you can get. Obviously, this is updating for everything. So with any action. So in the next lesson, we'll add a switch, which will allow us to call up multiple actions and update multiple variables inside the state that we set up in here. Okay, so for now, let's go into actions. And in actions, this is where we are going to make a call to fetch the user, to save the user, to save posts, and everything like that. So for that, we'll need to import Firebase from Firebase, because we'll need to do calls to our Firebase database. And we'll say export function fetch user, because we must export it, because this is the function that our application, our front end, will actually call in order to trigger a database action. So for now, we'll be returning a dispatch, and this function will make a call to the database. So in order to make a call to the database, and this is the first time that we do it in this lesson, you have to say database.firestore, and again, I forgot the major sign, and we say collection. So we do everything that we did in order to save it. However, the last call, the last function will be different. So db, better yet, doc firebase.auth.currentUser.uid, and instead of set, we say get. Easy enough, right? And we say we set the callback so that we can receive what comes from it. You get a snapshot from that callback. Arrow function, as always. Open that up, and now we say if snapshot.exists, then we'll dispatch, which is basically saying we'll send to the reducer a call. Let me do it like that, which will contain a type, and this type will be of the type user state change. User state change is a variable which will be in constant. We'll create in a second, but let's just end this call, which will be with current user snapshot.data. So how this works is we make a call to our Firestore, we get the dispatch, and then when we see that the snapshot exists and that we are able to get data from the database, we'll send a dispatch with the type of the user state and a current user, which will then be a call to the reducer, which will update the state of the current user variable. Okay, so now let's handle the type, and for that I'm going to come into constants and simply export const user state change equals to user state change, and I'm going to grab this and simply copy it. This is just, again, so that everything is better structured and that you don't make any mistakes while typing user state change, for example. Okay, so user state change is here. However, we must import it. So in order to import it, I'm going to go up top and say import user state change, which will be from, and we are going to go one back, constants, index. And there we go. Now we are able to do everything else. So let's do it. Else, we can console log just to make sure we get all of the errors and make sure nothing goes wrong. So does not exist. In case that the snapshot doesn't exist, obviously that means that that user isn't in a database or something went terribly wrong. But for now, this is it. We don't need to do anything else. Again, we'll be adding a switch in here in order to have other actions, but I'll leave that to the next lesson in order to keep things as simple as possible. So let's close that up. We have this function, which we'll call up in our main file. So let's create main.js, and main.js will be the file that's called up after the landing, login, and register. Okay, so I'm going to say RCE, and in here, on component in mounts, we'll be calling up the this.fetchUser, or better yet, the fetch user, which will be contained inside props. However, we must do something else before that. Let's go into app.js, import Redux, and do everything that's needed in order to be able to access Redux. And for that, you'll first need to import the provider. And the provider is a tag which will engulf our components and everything that's inside our app. So let's say provider from React Redux. Then we'll need to create a store, call create a store inside of here. And in order to do that, we say create store and apply middleware. This is just boilerplate stuff, so you don't need to worry about it. I don't remember it from heart. It is just something that you must add every time that you start a project like this. So don't worry if you really don't get why we are doing this at the moment. So then we need to import our root reducer, which is the root folder of the reducer in our Redux, from Redux reducers. Okay. Then we'll need to import thunk, which allows us to use the dispatch function in here, and that simplifies the process a bunch. So Redux, better yet, Redux thunk, and then we'll create a store. So store equals to create store. And this store will be passing along the arguments root reducer, and we'll apply the middleware, which is thunk, Redux thunk, as I've said in the beginning of the lesson. Okay, so now we are basically set and done, and we are ready to use Redux. However, we must implement the provider first and foremost, and we'll need to import our main function. So in order to import our main function, again, really simple as we've done before, import main screen from components main. So now instead of returning this, we'll be returning our main components, or main screen in this case, that's what I've called it. I'm going to grab all of this and pass it along to main. And we'll also need to pass along the import for view and text. So I'm going to grab that and paste it here. Save it, that's it. However, we must now engulf, make the parent tag of main screen to be provider. This is the only way of accessing Redux within any component that comes inside the main screen, otherwise it won't work. And the other thing that you must pass along is a store, which in this case will be equal to store. Okay, so now we'll be able to finally access everything inside our data, inside our application, I know this may seem kind of complicated, but again, this is just boilerplate stuff which you get used to the more time goes by. Okay, so now in order to access the fetch user function inside main, we must add some functions inside the main function, the main component, and again, this is something that we'll do throughout the development process. So in order to do that, we'll need the connect function from React Redux. And this will allow us to connect to Redux. Then we'll need to bind our actions to these components. And for that, we say bind actions creators from Redux. And finally, we must import the function that we have inside our action at index.js, which is called fetch user. And for that, simply open curly brackets and say from Redux actions index. And there we go. Now we have everything ready in order to actually make the call for this action. And for that, we must first go into our export.defaults. And instead of just doing it like this, we must call some functions in order to bind our component to Redux and to our function that we must call right now, which is called fetch user. So it is really simple. This is the last part that we must do, and it's called map dispatch to props, and this will connect like that. This will connect again the function to our props, and because of that, we'll be able to access in this component. Equals to dispatch arrow function bind actions. I made a mistake there. Actions creators, and then we pass along an object containing all of the functions that we want to access, and in that we've called up top. In this case, it is fetch user. Then we say comma dispatch, passing along the dispatch variable. Okay, there we go. We are almost done. So now for the final part, all we have to do is call up connect and pass it along null, map dispatch to props, and then put parentheses inside covering main. So do it this way, otherwise it will fail. Okay, so now we are free to access the fetch user in these components. So we can simply come in here in component it mounts and say this.props.fetch user. Oops. And that will call up index.js, which then, by calling dispatch, will call up the reducers at user.js, and this will update the state of current user with what we get in our action. So again, this might seem overly complicated, but the more you use it, the easier it gets and the most straightforward it is. So I'm going to save this and run the project. Okay, so I've run the app and no errors appeared, which is a good sign. However, we didn't see what came out of it. So in order to see it, I'm going to go into index.js, and in here I'm going to console log the snapshot. Coming back, we get an object which will contain all of the relevant data. So in here it is a bit confusing. So let's do it in a different way. I'm going to say .data, open brackets, open parentheses, better yet, and we get the object containing the information of the user, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so now in order to access the data inside main, we'll have to do one more thing, and this, I promise, will be the last part of this lesson, which will be coming in here, and we'll create another function. This function won't be directed at actions, it will be directed at the reducer. So map state to props equals to store, and in here we'll create an arrow function, parentheses, curly brackets, and in here we set up our props in order to access the variables that are inside the state, the Redux state. So in this case will be current user store.userState .current user. And now instead of null inside the connect, it will be map state to props. Okay, so this means that we are now freely able to access the user's data inside our component. And in order to do this, I'm saying const current user inside curly brackets, which will be equal to this.props. And now, if we do the console log inside here, we'll get the data. So I'm going to remove this console log from here, and I'm going to come back to our project. We'll get undefined first, and then we get the object. This is because it renders first, and it is still fetching the data from the user, and only then does it fetch the user. And whenever you fetch a user and something updates inside Redux, the component will re-render because it is a variable that's inside of these props, inside of the props of the component. So it will re-render and we don't have to deal with anything else. So yeah, that's it. Now we are able to grab this, come in here and say, for example, current user.name is logged in. And if you do this, an error will appear. However, we can say if current user equals to undefined, then we'll return an empty tag. So view, close that up. And so now it will check if the user is undefined. If it is, then nothing will appear. And you can see if I reload the page, you'll see that it goes blank for a second. Now, if it exists, then it goes to this return, and then it will show the current user's name and say is logged in. Okay, so that's it. Our Redux is working. We are able to make calls from Redux. We are able to save our global state of the application inside Redux, which will mean that we don't need to worry that much about structure and be worried about sending the current user and passing the current user around to every single component. So now everything will be updated within Redux, and every component that's using the variables that are inside Redux will get updated as they get updated. It is a really cool technology to use, and one that you should for sure use, and we'll make the full use out of in this lesson during this series, better yet. So yeah, this lesson will be in a different branch inside of my repository. Go down below, there's a link for my GitHub, find it, and if you have any problems, feel free to download that branch from the repository. It is tagged as lesson 3 and the name of the lesson, so feel free to use it, download it, and everything should be working as it should be if you failed at some point of this lesson. Also, if you have any questions, then please do leave them down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked the video. If you disliked it, then dislike it and let me know why you didn't like this lesson. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you again tomorrow, and ciao!